Hi, I'm Timothy. In this video, we explore the unsettling reality that while eating is meant to sustain life, it can sometimes become the very thing that ends it. From a bug-eating contest where a woman ate insects without even chewing, to a father who fought for his life against a donut, grasping for air that would never come. It was July 19, 2015, in a commercial shopping plaza in Changsha, China, where an event that had already gone wrong before anyone in that crowd knew to call it that. Sun Yuting was 27 and worked as an inventory clerk at a regional warehouse distribution center on the eastern side of the city. She tracked stock, filed discrepancy reports, and spent most of her shifts on her feet. She had been setting money aside for several months toward a new smartphone when a local electronics retailer posted a plaza flyer announcing a contest with that exact model as the grand prize. She registered the same day. And I don't blame her. I'd probably do the same thing. That's until I read the contest description. The competition ran contestants through multiple timed rounds, mealworms, then crickets, then cockroaches, with the fastest finisher advancing. There was no medical screening process, no qualified safety oversight, and no medical personnel stationed on or near the platform. The organizers were just retail employees. Yep, there's no way I'm participating in that contest. They lost me at mealworms. The stage was a folding table on a riser, roughly 18 inches above the plaza pavement, surrounded by a crowd of several dozen people filming on their phones, while a staff member with a handheld microphone kept the energy climbing. By the third round, Sun was trailing the lead contestant by a visible margin. Witnesses near the front of the crowd described her picking up her pace sharply, lifting handfuls of cockroaches and swallowing without chewing, a strategy the other contestants were not using at that rate. A staff member positioned near the stage leaned toward her twice during this interval and gestured for her to slow down. Sun waved her off without breaking her rhythm. The crowd was loud enough that the gesture was probably all the warning she registered. Sun had been coughing intermittently since roughly the midpoint of that round, short, dry bursts that most witnesses initially took as part of the physical effort of the contest. A woman standing approximately 20 feet back in the crowd told investigators that Sun's posture shifted before anything else, shoulders pulling upward, head angling forward, both hands pressing against her own chest. I don't fault the crowd for not reading it faster. From where most of them were standing, those first several seconds looked like exertion, not collapse. Then she gagged, a full-body contraction visible from the back of the crowd, stepped sideways off the stage platform, and her right foot caught the edge on the way down. She landed on her left side on the concrete at an angle. The host stopped mid-sentence. The crowd noise dropped person by person in an uneven wave from front to back. Two audience members in the front row laughed before the man standing beside them pointed sharply and said something. The contestants nearest to her on stage did not immediately step down. A woman who later identified herself as a nurse had been standing near the back of the crowd. She pushed forward when Sun did not move and reached her in under 30 seconds. What she found was not ambiguous. Sun was not breathing in any functional way. Her chest rose, but no air exchanged. Blood-tinged saliva was present at the corners of her mouth, and fragments of insect exoskeleton were visible in the material around it. The nurse immediately began standard choking first aid, including back blows and abdominal thrusts. When those measures failed and Sun became unresponsive, the nurse transitioned to CPR and chest compressions, while another bystander attempted to monitor the airway for any visible obstruction. A store employee near the entrance placed the emergency call at that point. The ambulance arrived approximately 11 minutes later. Paramedics initiated and continued airway intervention through transport, including advanced airway management and resuscitation efforts. Sun was pronounced dead at a regional hospital shortly after arrival. The event was canceled without announcement. No public statement was issued by the retailer. Local coverage focused on the absence of safety planning and the lack of any medical presence at a competition that required rapid ingestion of foreign material in volume. I think dying over a smartphone is among the saddest sentences a coroner's report has ever implied without stating it directly. Sun Yuting made a choice, a bad one, in public with people actively trying to stop her. The next victim made no choice at all. It was March 30, 2018, in a mid-floor apartment in the eastern residential quarter of Murcia, Spain, 2 days before Good Friday, when something that had been sitting unremarked on the kitchen counter for 3 days became the only object in the room that mattered. Izan Varela was 18 and in his final year of secondary school. He played center midfielder for a neighborhood football club and had been selected for a regional youth tournament scheduled for the following month. He had no documented health conditions, lived with his mother in a 2-bedroom apartment, and kept a regular afternoon routine: school until 3, training twice a week, homework before dinner. A decorated Easter egg package had arrived at the apartment 3 days before the holiday, addressed to the household by name. Several similar packages had come in that same stretch of days from family and neighbors, and no one distinguished it from any of them. The one in question was wrapped conventionally, foil-covered eggs nested in bright paper, and placed with the others on the kitchen counter without examination. There was no reason to examine it, and I totally see that, especially if it looked exactly like everything else sitting next to it. Izan came home from school that afternoon and took 1 egg from the package while his mother was at the stove preparing dinner. She did not stop him. She had no reason to. I think about how many times that exact scene plays out in households during Easter week and how completely unremarkable it looks from any angle. He ate it standing at the counter, left the wrapper beside the package, and went to the living room. Approximately 50 minutes later, Izan told his mother his stomach hurt. She told him to lie down. Within 10 minutes, he was vomiting in the bathroom. Before and during this period, he had also begun showing heavy sweating, visible restlessness, and intermittent muscle twitching around his hands and face, which his mother later described as like he could not keep still in his own skin. That's word for word from what I've read. His speech had become slightly slurred, and he appeared increasingly disoriented. Immediately, she moved toward food poisoning as the explanation, the most immediate one available to her. Nothing about his presentation at that point would have suggested otherwise to any reasonable person. He had eaten something. The reasoning was not negligent. It was the ordinary kind of wrong. A neighbor from across the hall had come over by then. She was standing in the kitchen doorway when Izan came out of the hallway at a slow, uneven pace, his left shoulder dropping toward the wall. His mother reached him first. He did not make it to the couch. His gait had become unstable in a way that suggested neurological involvement, with brief jerking movements in his arms as he tried to steady himself. His legs folded under him, and he went down onto the kitchen tile. The neighbor immediately called for help. The convulsions continued within seconds of him hitting the floor. The neighbor said she moved toward him instinctively and stopped because she did not know what touching him would do. His mother was already on her knees beside him. Foam had appeared at the corners of his mouth. I don't think there is a way to be prepared for what that looks like. The convulsions continued for an estimated 2 to 3 minutes, though both women told investigators it felt considerably longer. By the time they slowed, Izan was no longer responding to his mother's voice. His breathing had become audible from across the room, irregular and labored, with long pauses between each inhalation. Paramedics arrived approximately 8 minutes after the call, initiated airway management on the kitchen floor, and continued resuscitation efforts during transport to a regional medical facility. But it was all for nothing. Death was confirmed at the regional medical facility later that evening. Toxicology identified a concentrated organophosphate compound consistent with pesticide-grade substances introduced into the confectionery before consumption. Organ failure progressed rapidly following ingestion. The package was collected and processed as evidence. The investigation eventually connected its delivery to an individual with ties to the mother's former partner. The former partner was charged but later acquitted due to insufficient physical evidence linking him directly to the preparation or delivery of the package. I find it genuinely difficult to sit with that outcome. The next story has no villain, no motive, just 40 people sitting down to share a meal that the animal itself had already made deadly. It was November 12, 2014, in a coastal village in eastern Samar, Philippines. The fishing that morning had produced something unusual, and by early afternoon, the smell of a communal meal had moved through the neighborhood, bringing death with it. Ramil Dacuno was 51 years old and had spent the better part of 3 decades working the local coastline. Junel Pablico, 34, had worked alongside Ramil for several years, and his wife Merla, 29, helped manage their household and coordinated with neighbors when the catch was large enough to share. Now you have to understand that they were not careless people. They were people who had learned to read their environment through repetition and collective memory, and that memory told them that sea turtle meat had been consumed in this area before, without incident. The turtle had been caught offshore and brought in that morning. It was large enough that keeping it within one household made less sense than sharing it. More than 40 people eventually ate from the pot. There were concerns raised before the meal, and those concerns were set aside because the precedent said otherwise. I think the hardest part of this story is that the decision to share made complete sense within the framework of what these people knew and had lived. Generosity and precedent together form a convincing argument, and neither one looks like negligence from the inside. By the time the gathering ended and families had returned to their homes, every person who had eaten had already absorbed something their bodies would spend the next several hours failing to manage. The first reports of illness began several hours after the meal. Over the following days, it was no longer one household managing a sick family member. It was an entire section of the village moving simultaneously into crisis. Ramil collapsed outside his home first. His neighbor, who was himself experiencing severe stomach cramps at the time, described Ramil doubled forward with both hands on the ground, vomiting repeatedly, unable to straighten. His condition worsened over roughly 30 minutes until he became increasingly weak, unable to stand, and eventually lost responsiveness altogether. I don't think the neighbor who watched him collapse fully understood what was happening in those first minutes. What he described was consistent with severe dehydration and systemic deterioration progressing faster than anyone present had a framework to explain. Junel's condition followed a different trajectory. The vomiting that began with recognizable symptoms worsened, severe, sustained gastrointestinal distress. His wife had already developed her own symptoms before family members could assess how serious his had become. He lost consciousness before any transport could be arranged. Merla became unresponsive while relatives were physically attempting to carry her toward a vehicle. She was set down on the ground when she could no longer be supported upright. Relatives present described not knowing which direction to move because simultaneous emergencies were active in multiple homes at the same moment, voices calling from different structures along the same path. Family members and village officials placed calls for medical assistance when the simultaneous collapses made it clear this was beyond what the community could manage. Help arrived approximately 45 minutes after the first calls. By then, 3 people were already showing no signs of life prior to stabilization attempts. The regional medical team's documented summary attributed all 3 deaths to cardiac and respiratory failure, secondary to colonotoxism. Systemic poisoning from sea turtle meat contaminated through the animal's accumulated dietary toxins. The toxin acts on the nervous and cardiovascular systems. There is no antidote, and onset is delayed enough that most people who consumed the meal did not realize they were in danger until symptoms were already advanced. The surviving patients, more than 30 of them, recovered over the following days under medical supervision at regional facilities. Authorities issued formal reminders that harvesting sea turtles was illegal under national wildlife protection law and carried criminal penalties. Poverty does not excuse the poaching of an endangered species, but it does explain, without softening, why a large animal pulled from the sea looks like a solution rather than a risk to people who have spent their lives managing scarcity with whatever is available. The next story's victim made the same kind of calculated gamble with his food, recorded every second of it, and had no one around to call for help when the gamble didn't pay out. It was August 8, 2017, on Kure Atoll. This is the date and place where a survival challenge came to an end that no one saw coming, a quiet shift from preparation to a final, irreversible countdown. Keone Maka was 32 years old and worked part-time as a landscaper in Honolulu while building a survival content channel online. Although modest, his subscriber count was a few thousand people who followed for practical outdoor content. He was physically capable and had spent months planning this trip, joining and being embedded in a permitted research support expedition to the atoll under strict environmental access conditions, obtaining federal entry authorization through the appropriate monument management process, packing action cameras, and committing to one rule: 7 days, solo, eating only what he could catch. I always watch island survival videos of YouTubers, but I never actually thought of how tedious behind-the-scenes stuff is. He had announced the challenge publicly before departing, and that accountability was not incidental to who he was. The first few days were very typical survival content, but by day 4, the footage documented what food shortage looks like when it compounds slowly. His movements between shots were less efficient. His hands were steadier setting the camera down than carrying equipment. The fish had not cooperated at the rate his plan assumed, and his reserves had been working against a deficit since at least day 2, with reef catch success fluctuating naturally due to tidal conditions and species availability. When he finally caught a crab, he cooked it and ate it, which, objectively, is a breathtakingly stupid roll of the dice when you can't ID a coastal crab. Yet I can't help but cut him some slack. 4 days of gnawing hunger have a way of turning reckless desperation into what feels like pure, logical survival. And honestly, I'd like to think I'd be smarter, but with my stomach eating itself, I'd probably be cracking that same shell open before the camera even stopped recording. Within several hours, the next recording showed him seated near the shelter, speaking with visible difficulty. Words were forming unevenly, his lips moving slightly behind their intended positions. He attempted to stand once and failed to hold his footing. He sat back down without comment. Subsequent recordings, recovered in sequence by investigators, documented the progression without interruption. There were episodes of vomiting, repeated, undramatic, just the physical fact of them. Between episodes, his movements became shorter and less purposeful. A recording from late that evening showed him on his hands and knees beside the shelter, not moving, his breathing audible on the microphone as fast and shallow. Then he was on his side. I've read enough incident documentation to know that what makes footage like this difficult is not what happens. It's the pace. It takes hours, not seconds. The final recording showed him collapsed against the base of the shelter, one arm across his chest, the camera still running from a rock approximately 4 feet away. No emergency signal was activated at any point. No satellite communicator was included in his documented gear. And under monument permitting requirements, any participant evacuation or emergency escalation would typically require coordination through expedition leadership and pre-established check-in protocols. A wildlife survey team conducting scheduled fieldwork in the area discovered his body 3 days after the final recording. The medical examiner identified the cause of death as cardiorespiratory failure, consistent with natural toxin poisoning. They identified the crab he ate as the devil crab. His parents traveled to Honolulu to receive his remains. His mother had followed his channel since the beginning, according to people who knew the family. Just a quick PSA: before you eat anything pulled from the wild, identify it first. That step costs less than 60 seconds, and it is the only variable in this account that could have changed the outcome. Keone didn't know what he was eating, and that uncertainty cost him everything. The next one knew exactly what was on his plate, and that was precisely the point. It was February 21st, 2016, inside a medium-security correctional facility in Leeds, England. Guards on duty were completely unaware of what one man had already decided before the morning count was even finished. Harvey Lister was 41 years old. and had been serving time for fraud-related offenses connected to a scheme that, by his own admission during sentencing, had taken years to build and less than a week to collapse. To understand what happens next, I have to take you back to before his conviction. He had worked as a financial consultant at a mid-size advisory firm, managing accounts with enough precision that his colleagues described him as meticulous, the kind of person who documented everything and left no loose ends. That's what his life was like. Prison had not changed that discipline. His medical intake forms were thorough. His allergy to peaches, documented, flagged, and noted in his records as severe and potentially fatal, had been formally logged by facility medical staff at the time of his admission. Fellow inmates who later spoke to investigators described him as someone who had been pulling inward for weeks, quieter than usual, eating less, not engaging in the small, grinding conversations that fill the long hours of shared confinement. And I'd probably be in the same position as him, always thinking about regret, imagining the life I've had, and appreciating it from afar. During the lunch period, Harvey arranged a food trade with another inmate seated nearby. The exchange was brief and unremarkable from the outside, the kind of casual, informal swap that happens across cafeteria tables in facilities like that one every day, even though such exchanges are formally prohibited. The inmate he traded with had a peach on his tray. Harvey took it without apparent urgency. The symptoms did not wait. Within minutes, facial swelling was visible across the table. A man seated roughly 6 feet away said he first noticed that Harvey's lip looked wrong, thicker, asymmetrical, and then that his breathing had changed to something audible and labored. Harvey said nothing. He did not stand. He remained seated while the sounds coming from him became harder to place. A low, pressurized wheeze that a second inmate described as unlike anything he had heard before in the facility or outside of it. He went over against the cafeteria table rather than straight down, his upper body dropping sideways against the edge before he reached the floor. That was when the room shifted. Several men pushed back from their seats simultaneously. One inmate closest to him later said Harvey's hands went to his throat, not grabbing, more like pressing against it, while his legs moved without coordination. His face, the inmate said, had changed color. The sounds had become shorter and further apart. The incident was partially captured on fixed CCTV cameras covering the dining hall, which later became a primary source for reconstructing the timeline. Facility medical staff arrived and initiated emergency treatment on site. An ambulance was contacted immediately, and additional emergency responders reached the facility in approximately 7 minutes. Intervention was attempted continuously from the point of collapse through transport. Unfortunately, he was pronounced dead before further care could be administered. The coroner's findings identified the cause of death as anaphylactic shock, a severe allergic reaction that caused the airway to close and the body's systems to fail in rapid sequence. The internal investigation that followed reached its conclusion quickly. The farewell note removed most uncertainty about what had occurred and why. There was no public inquiry, but the case was still subject to independent oversight review in accordance with custodial death protocols in England and Wales. I find it genuinely hard to know where accountability sits in a case like this, and not because the facts are unclear, but because the institution, the individual, and the failure of intervention all occupied the same room at the same time. And if Harvey made his choice in silence, alone in a prison cafeteria, with no one cheering him on, the next man died surrounded by a crowd that was actually rooting for him. It was October 14, 2013, in Daegu, South Korea. The atmosphere in a bakery was celebratory, but the real event of the day had nothing to do with the anniversary banners and everything to do with the silent, unfolding emergency at Table 3. Hanul Seok was 38 years old and worked as a maintenance mechanic at a municipal bus depot on the eastern side of the city, a position he had held for 9 years. He had 2 children, a daughter aged 11 and a son aged 7, and his wife worked part-time at a dry goods distributor. A cash prize equivalent to roughly $140 had been enough to make his Saturday feel like a reasonable use of his time. The contest format was simple: Consume the most glazed donuts within a 5-minute window. 11 participants had registered. Hanul took the third seat from the left. He performed well in the first 2 minutes, methodically, not frantically. By the third minute, he had pulled ahead by 2 pieces. That margin is where things started deteriorating because it was enough to make him press rather than pace. I think this is the part that's hardest to dismiss. The lead was real, the time was short, and the logic in his head probably said push. Most people in that position would have made the same calculation. By the 4th minute, witnesses at adjacent tables described his chewing as visibly reduced. He was breaking pieces apart with his fingers and loading them without clearing the previous mouthful. The event host, standing beside the table, later told investigators he had noticed Hanul's pace accelerating but had not considered intervening. The staff behind the counter were watching the scoreboard, not the contestants. A designated staff member trained in basic first aid was present but not positioned directly beside the contestants during active consumption. The moment arrived without the signals people expect. He did not cough first. He did not gag visibly. He simply stopped, his hands still resting on the table, his posture upright, and then one hand came up to his throat, not both hands, just one, pressing flat against his neck below the jaw. He sat that way for what 2 witnesses independently described as a pause lasting only a few seconds before pushing back from the table. He was standing but not moving in any purposeful direction. His face was already darkening, not gradually, but in the way color changes when circulation is cut rather than reduced. Over the next minute, discoloration around his lips and face became progressively more pronounced rather than instantaneous. A woman seated 1 table to his right stood up first. A staff member from behind the counter was already moving toward him. I will say this plainly. Watching someone's face change color in that particular way is not something you misread in the moment. The people in that room understood something was wrong before a single word was said. The employee reached him and first administered back blows before attempting abdominal thrusts. She repeated the sequence multiple times. The response became increasingly urgent as he failed to expel the obstruction. Small fragments of dough were visible on the floor near his feet afterward, but his airway did not clear. He had gone from standing to partially supported within roughly 40 seconds of the first visible sign. The coloring around his mouth had shifted toward blue. He could not cough. He could not speak. His legs were no longer holding him fully upright. The store manager placed the emergency call from a desk phone near the rear of the establishment. The call was logged at 11:42 in the morning, as recorded in emergency dispatch logs. Ambulance crews arrived approximately 6 minutes later. By the time paramedics reached him, Hanul had lost consciousness and was on the floor. Resuscitation efforts were performed on scene and continued during transport. He was pronounced dead at a regional hospital at 12:21 that afternoon. The attending physician's findings were a preliminary medical conclusion based on emergency assessment and later review. A dense, compacted mass of partially chewed glazed dough had created a complete mechanical obstruction of the airway. There was no indication of any prior medical condition. Basically, he asphyxiated. The bakery permanently discontinued eating competitions following the incident. Hanul's family filed a civil lawsuit against the establishment within 8 months, alleging failure to provide adequate safety oversight and trained personnel capable of managing a choking emergency during a food-based event. The case was settled out of court approximately 2 years later under undisclosed terms. 2 children lost their father over a $140 prize on a Saturday morning, and I don't know how to make that sentence land any softer than it does. His daughter was 11. His son was 7. The bakery reopened the following Monday.